On the evening of October 1st, 2012, Mackinac was settling into the quiet rhythm of a small Welsh town at the edge of the Dyfi Valley. It was a kind of place where neighbors recognized each other's cars, where children played outside until dusk, and where danger felt abstract, something that happened elsewhere. April Jones, 5 years old, was doing what she had done countless times before playing with friends near her home on Bryn Wygog Estate. Nothing about that Monday suggested it would fracture the town's sense of safety forever. The last confirmed moments of April's freedom were painfully ordinary. She was riding her bike, laughing, moving between the small clusters of houses that made up the estate. At around 7 p.m., as daylight thinned into a gray autumn evening, she was seen getting into a vehicle, a Land Rover, near the edge of the road. Within minutes, she was gone. By the time concern turned into alarm, the vehicle had disappeared into narrow roads leading out of town, swallowed by darkness and distance. When April failed to come home, her parents' initial worry quickly escalated into terror. There was no gradual realization, no slow burning suspicion. This was a child who never wandered far, in a place where parents believed they could trust the familiar faces around them. Her absence felt wrong immediately, like a noise that should not exist in a quiet room. Calls were made, doors knocked on, names shouted into the cooling air. The answers came back empty. Police were alerted that night, and the response was swift. Within hours, Mackinac transformed from a sleepy community into the center of a national emergency. Sirens cut through the dark. Officers fanned out through streets, fields, and wooded paths. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters scanned the land from above, their lights sweeping across hedgerows and riverbanks. Volunteers arrived without being asked, friends, neighbors, strangers drawn by the instinctive need to help find a missing child. As the hours passed, hope and dread existed side by side. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant sound, carried the unbearable possibility that April might be found alive or that she might not be. For her parents, the night stretched into something almost unreal, a continuous state of waiting without rest. They stood at the center of a widening circle of attention, watched by police, comforted by neighbors, yet fundamentally alone in their fear. No parent is prepared for the moment when the world stops making sense, when a routine evening becomes a crisis with no instructions on how to endure it. By midnight, the scale of the search had grown dramatically. Roads leading out of Mackinac were monitored. Officers began collecting statements from anyone who might have seen April or noticed something unusual. It was during this process that a critical detail emerged. CCTV footage from a nearby camera had captured a Land Rover stopping near the estate around the time April disappeared. The image was grainy, the distance frustrating, but the implication was chilling. This was no longer a case of a child wandering off. Something deliberate had occurred. The knowledge spread quickly among police and more slowly, in fragments, among the town's residents. Fear shifted shape. It was no longer just concern for April. It was a dawning realization that someone had taken her, and that person might be someone who lived nearby, someone known. Mackinac's closeness, its greatest strength now, became a source of collective unease. Doors that were rarely locked were bolted shut. Parents held their children tighter. The familiar streets felt altered, as if trust itself had been quietly removed overnight. Through the early hours of the morning, the search did not stop. Rain began to fall, turning paths muddy and sapping energy, but no one suggested slowing down. April's face appeared everywhere on television screens, on hastily printed posters, in the minds of people who had never met her but felt they knew her already. She became not just a missing child, but a symbol of innocence under threat, of a boundary crossed that should never be crossed. For a family, each passing hour deepened the agony. Hope is a fragile thing in such moments, sustained by imagination more than evidence. Perhaps she was cold but alive, hidden somewhere, waiting to be found. Perhaps she was frightened but unharmed. Those thoughts were all that stood between survival and collapse. Yet the absence of any sign, no cries, no footprints leading to safety pressed heavily against those hopes. As dawn approached, exhaustion settled over the town like a fog. Search teams regrouped, adjusted plans, and pushed outward, combing fields and waterways beyond the estate. The Dyfi River, beautiful and unforgiving, became a focus of concern. So did the surrounding forest, dense and quiet. Every location searched without result narrowed the possibilities, each negative finding both a relief and a new source of dread. By morning, Mackinac was no longer alone in its vigil. The case had captured national attention. News crews arrived, their cameras recording scenes of police tape, tired volunteers, and a community holding its breath. Appeals were made directly to the public for information. April's parents spoke with a courage that seemed almost impossible, asking anyone who knew anything at all to come forward. Their voices carried not accusation, but desperation. What made the situation particularly harrowing was the absence of certainty. There was no definitive crime scene, no clear direction, no answers. Just a child gone, a vehicle seen, and a growing sense that time was the enemy. Every investigator understood that the first hours are critical in missing child cases. Every parent watching understood something even more basic, that the longer April remained missing, the harder it would be to imagine a good ending. By the end of that first night, the town had crossed an invisible line. Life before April's disappearance was already receding, replaced by a shared trauma that would not easily fade. The search would continue, intensify, and eventually uncover truths that few were prepared to face. But in those initial hours, all that existed was uncertainty, raw, relentless, and unbearable. A 5-year-old girl had vanished into the dark, and an entire community was left staring into the same darkness, hoping against reason that she would come back out. Daylight did not bring relief to Mackinac. It brought clarity, and with it, fear sharpened into something harder and more volatile. The search for April Jones resumed with renewed urgency as the morning of October 2nd unfolded. What had begun as a local emergency now became one of the largest missing child operations in British history. Hundreds of police officers joined volunteers already exhausted from a sleepless night. Military personnel were placed on standby. The landscape around the town, fields, forests, riverbanks was methodically divided, searched, and searched again. At the center of the investigation was the Land Rover seen on CCTV. Officers worked quickly to identify and locate the vehicle, aware that time was slipping through their fingers. By midday, the owner had been traced, Mark Bridger, a 46-year-old man who lived on the outskirts of town. His home, isolated and surrounded by woodland, suddenly became a focal point of intense police interest. When officers arrested Bridger later that day, the news spread through Mackinac with shocking speed. The arrest brought a brief, dangerous surge of hope. An arrest meant answers, people told themselves. It meant April might still be alive. Yet even in those early moments, unease crept in. Bridger was not a stranger from outside. He was local. He had lived in the area for years. The idea that the threat had been so close, so familiar, ignited a deep and bitter anger. For parents in the town, fear turned inward, transforming into self-reproach and rage. How could this have happened here? How could no one have seen it coming? Police searched Bridger's property with forensic teams moving carefully through his house, his vehicle, and the surrounding land. Each item removed bags of evidence. Sealed containers was watched by neighbors and media alike. The visual language of investigation is powerful: white suits, gloved hands, measured steps. It signals gravity, finality. It also feeds imagination. Rumors began almost immediately, filling the gaps left by official silence. Some were hopeful, others dark. All of them reflected the same unbearable tension, the need to know what had happened to April. As the search expanded beyond the town, the emotional tone shifted again. Volunteers continued to arrive, some traveling long distances, compelled by the image of a missing 5-year-old and the plea of her family. There was a grim solidarity among them. People who did not speak much but worked side by side, eyes trained on the ground, on the water, on the trees. Every discarded item, a shoe, a piece of fabric, caused hearts to leap, then sink. Each false alarm was both relief and torment. Behind the scenes, investigators were confronting the growing likelihood that this was not a rescue mission. Evidence recovered from Bridger's Land Rover was deeply troubling, though details were not immediately released. What was clear, however, was that the case had crossed into a darker territory. The absence of April after so many hours, combined with what police were finding, began to reshape expectations. Hope did not vanish all at once. It eroded, grain by grain, under the weight of reality. For April's parents, this period was a study in controlled devastation. They remained visible, issuing statements, thanking searchers, appealing for information, all while living inside a private nightmare. Their composure became part of the story, a testament to parental love under unimaginable strain. Yet those who saw them up close spoke of the exhaustion etched into their faces, the way hope seemed to require conscious effort to maintain. They were suspended between two horrors, the fear of what might have happened and the fear of never knowing at all. As the days progressed, public emotion intensified. Vigils were held. Candles flickered in the autumn air. Messages of support arrived from across the country. At the same time, anger simmered just beneath the surface. The idea that a child could be taken so quickly, so brazenly, ignited calls for accountability, for explanations, for reassurances that felt impossible to give. The trust that binds small communities together had been ruptured, replaced by suspicion and grief. When police confirmed that April was now being treated as having been abducted, the words landed with brutal force. Language matters in moments like this. Abduction stripped away the last illusions of innocence, replacing them with the recognition of intent. Someone had chosen to do this. Someone had made a decision that could not be undone. The investigation narrowed, its focus intensifying on Bridger, and the evidence linking him to the disappearance. Yet even with an arrest, the central agony remained unresolved. April had not been found. There was no location to return to, no child to rescue, no certainty to cling to. Each press conference, each carefully worded update, reinforced the same unbearable fact. The most important question, where's April, had no answer. By the end of the second day, Mackinac was no longer just a town searching for a missing child. It had become a place defined by waiting, by collective grief held in check by procedure and hope. The arrest had changed the direction of the investigation, but it had not brought closure. Instead, it opened the door to a more disturbing phase, one in which evidence would speak, where April could not, and where justice would be asked to operate in the absence of the one thing everyone longed for most, her return. As the investigation moved forward, a grim truth settled over Mackinac and far beyond it. The case against Mark Bridger would have to be built without the one piece of evidence that offers families both certainty and a place to grieve a body. April Jones had not been found. Days of searching had yielded nothing that could lead rescuers to her alive, nor investigators to her remains. The absence was no longer just emotional. It became the central legal and moral challenge of the case. Behind closed doors, detectives faced the task of reconstructing a crime that left almost no visible trace. What they did have were moments captured on CCTV, forensic findings from Bridger's vehicle and home, and inconsistencies in his account of the night April disappeared. Each fragment, on its own, was incomplete. Together, prosecutors would later argue, they formed a narrative too coherent to ignore. CCTV footage became the backbone of the timeline. The grainy images showed April getting into Bridger's Land Rover, then the vehicle driving away. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. There was no footage of her getting out, no footage of her returning. The camera, indifferent and unblinking, recorded absence as clearly as presence. For investigators, that gap was deafening. It marked the moment when April vanished from the observable world. Inside Bridger's Land Rover, forensic teams found evidence that deepened the horror. Traces of blood were discovered, later confirmed to be April's. The quantity mattered. It was not the sort of injury that could be explained away as minor or accidental. Forensic experts concluded that the blood loss was consistent with fatal harm. This assessment would become one of the most emotionally charged aspects of the trial's science, stepping in where certainty could not otherwise exist. Bridger's behavior during police interviews only intensified suspicion. His explanations shifted. He claimed at one point that he had accidentally run April over in panic, disposing of her body. Later, he changed his account, denying responsibility for her death altogether. These contradictions were not merely inconsistencies. They were, in the eyes of investigators, indicators of deception. Each change in story widened the emotional distance between Bridger and any claim of accident or remorse. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on forensic logic. Without a body, intent and outcome had to be inferred rather than demonstrated directly. Experts explained to the jury how blood evidence behaves, how it accumulates, what it suggests about injury severity. They described search efforts that covered vast areas without result, arguing that the absence of remains did not imply survival, but concealment. It was a cold, methodical process, and it had to be. Emotion alone could not secure a conviction. For April's family, sitting through this phase of the investigation was a different kind of torment. Every detail discussed in court forced them to imagine scenarios they had desperately tried to avoid. Without a body, the mind fills in gaps relentlessly. Science offered conclusions, but not comfort. Knowing that the evidence suggested April was dead did not give them the finality of goodbye. It left them suspended between knowledge and denial, between fact and the aching human need for physical proof. Public reaction to the trial was intense. Some struggled with the idea that someone could be convicted of murder without a body ever being found. Others saw the evidence as overwhelming, the logic unavoidable. This tension played out in headlines, discussions, and quiet conversations in homes across the country. At its core was a deeper question. What does justice look like when the victim is never recovered? The jury's task was immense. They were asked not only to assess evidence, but to carry the moral weight of absence. They had to decide whether the story told by blood patterns, timelines, and expert testimony was strong enough to replace what was missing. In doing so, they became stand-in for a society that needed an answer, even an incomplete one. When the verdict came guilty of abduction, murder, and perverting the course of justice, it landed with a heavy finality. Bridger was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term that reflected the gravity of his crimes. The law had spoken decisively, but it could not deliver what mattered most. April Jones was still missing. There would be no recovery, no funeral, no physical place for her parents to visit and say goodbye. The conviction closed the legal chapter, but it did not close the story. In many ways, it made the absence more permanent. The hope that had once driven searchers through fields and forests was now officially extinguished, replaced by a conclusion reached through inference rather than discovery. Justice had been done, the court declared, but grief does not follow legal timelines. For the investigators, the case would always remain unfinished in a fundamental sense. For the family, the verdict was not an ending, but a boundary life divided into before and after, with no bridge between. And for the public, the case of April Jones became a stark reminder that sometimes the truth arrives without the mercy of completeness, leaving behind only evidence, silence, and the enduring pain of a child who was taken and never brought home. When the courtroom doors finally closed on the case of April Jones, the legal system marked it as concluded. Files were archived, procedures completed, sentences handed down. But outside that space, in Mackinac and in the lives of April's family, nothing felt finished. The absence that had defined the investigation did not dissolve with the verdict. It hardened into something permanent, an unmovable fact around which everything else now had to be arranged. In the weeks after the trial, the town tried to return to something resembling normality. Shops reopened fully. Children went back to playing outside, though now under watchful eyes that never quite relaxed. Parents spoke more quietly, more cautiously. The disappearance of April Jones had altered the social fabric in ways that were subtle but enduring. Trust, once assumed, now required effort. Safety, once taken for granted, had become a shared responsibility weighed down by memory. For April's parents, the aftermath was defined not by resolution, but by endurance. There was no funeral, no grave, no physical ritual to mark the transition from presence to loss. Instead, they were left with memories and an official acknowledgement of death unsupported by the comfort of tangible proof. Grief in this form is uniquely cruel. It offers no closure, only an endless negotiation with the unknown. Each day carried the knowledge of what the evidence said, alongside the instinctive refusal to fully accept it. Public sympathy remained strong, but it evolved. The initial outpouring of candles and messages gave way to quieter forms of support charity work, remembrance events, conversations held away from cameras. April's name continued to be spoken, often in the context of child safety, community vigilance, and the dangers that can exist even in the most familiar places. Her story became a reference point, a warning, and a symbol, though none of those roles could ever compensate for who she was as a person. The failure to recover April's body remained a source of collective frustration and sorrow. Periodic searches were conducted based on information provided by Bridger, but none led to her remains. Each effort reopened wounds, raising hope only to let it fall again. The landscape itself, fields, woods, rivers became emotionally charged, carrying associations that would not fade. Nature, indifferent and unchanged, stood in stark contrast to human suffering attached to it. From a broader perspective, the case forced a national reckoning with uncomfortable realities. It demonstrated how modern justice can operate in the absence of the most definitive evidence, relying instead on forensic science, probability, and narrative coherence. It also exposed the limits of that system. A conviction could confirm responsibility, but it could not restore what had been taken, nor could it answer every question. The law provided an answer. It did not provide peace. Anger toward Mark Bridger did not diminish with time. If anything, it settled into something colder and more enduring. His refusal or inability to disclose the location of April's remains was seen not just as an extension of his crimes, but as an ongoing act of cruelty toward her family. Each day that passed without that knowledge was another day of punishment imposed not by the courts, but by his silence. And yet, amid the anger and grief, there were moments of profound solidarity. The way strangers had come together to search for April, the way a town had held a family in their darkest hours, became part of the story too. It did not erase the loss, but it stood as evidence of something else, that even in the aftermath of unimaginable harm, people are capable of collective compassion. That compassion did not solve the case, but it shaped how it was remembered. Years later, the name April Jones still carries weight. It evokes a child on a bicycle, a quiet street at dusk, a vehicle stopping where it should never have stopped. It evokes the unbearable question of how such a thing could happen, and the equally unbearable reality that sometimes there is no satisfying answer. Her story resists neat conclusions because her life was not meant to end in a courtroom judgment or forensic report. In the end, the case leaves behind a stark, unresolved truth. Justice was achieved in the only form available, through evidence and law. But closure to humankind remains elusive. April Jones is remembered not because of how she died, but because of how completely her absence reshaped the lives and assumptions of everyone touched by her story. In that sense, her disappearance did not end with a verdict. It continues, quietly and relentlessly, in memory, in grief, and in the unanswered silence left behind.